The life of Granville Sharp is another striking example of the same power of individual energy, a power which was afterwards transfused into the noble band of workers in the cause of slavery abolition, prominent among whom were Clarkson, Wilberforce, Buxton, and Brougham. But, giants though these men were in this cause, Granville Sharp was the first, and perhaps the greatest of them all, in point of perseverance, energy, and intrepidity. He began life as apprentice to a linen draper on Tower Hill. But, leaving that business after his apprenticeship was out, he next entered as a clerk in the Ordnance Office. And it was while engaged in that humble occupation that he carried on in his spare hours the work of Negro emancipation. He was always, even when an apprentice, ready to undertake any amount of volunteer labor where a useful purpose was to be served. Thus, while learning the linen drapery business, a fellow apprentice who lodged in the same house, and was a Unitarian, led him into frequent discussions on religious subjects. The Unitarian youth insisted that Granville's Trinitarian misconception of certain passages of Scripture arose from his want of acquaintance with the Greek tongue, on which he immediately set to work in his evening hours, and shortly acquired an intimate knowledge of Greek. A similar controversy with another fellow apprentice, a Jew, as to the interpretation of the prophecies, led him in like manner to undertake and overcome the difficulties of Hebrew. But the circumstance which gave the bias and direction to the main labors of his life originated in his generosity and benevolence. His brother William, a surgeon in Mincing Lane, gave gratuitous advice to the poor, and amongst the numerous applicants for relief at his surgery was a poor African named Jonathan Strong. It appeared that the Negro had been brutally treated by his master, a Barbados lawyer then in London, and became lame, almost blind, and unable to work. On which his owner, regarding him as of no further value as a chattel, cruelly turned him adrift into the streets to starve. This poor man, a mass of disease, supported himself by begging for a time, until he found his way to William Sharp, who gave him some medicine, and shortly after got him admitted to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where he was cured. On coming out of the hospital, the two brothers supported the Negro in order to keep him off the streets, but they had not the least suspicion at the time that anyone had a claim upon his person. They even succeeded in obtaining a situation for Strong with an apothecary, in whose service he remained for 2 years. And it was while he was attending his mistress behind the hackney coach, that his former owner, the Barbados lawyer, recognized him, and determined to recover possession of the slave, again rendered valuable by the restoration of his health. The lawyer employed 2 of the Lord Mayor's officers to apprehend Strong, and he was lodged in the Compter, until he could be shipped off to the West Indies. The Negro, bethinking him in his captivity of the kind services which Granville Sharp had rendered him in his great distress some years before, dispatched a letter to him requesting his help. Sharp had forgotten the name of Strong, but he sent a messenger to make inquiries, who returned saying that the keepers denied having any such person in their charge. His suspicions were aroused, and he went forthwith to the prison, and insisted upon seeing Jonathan Strong. He was admitted, and recognized the poor Negro, now in custody as a recaptured slave. Mr. Sharp charged the master of the prison at his own peril not to deliver up Strong to any person whatever, until he had been carried before the Lord Mayor, to whom Sharp immediately went, and obtained a summons against those persons who had seized and imprisoned Strong without a warrant. The parties appeared before the Lord Mayor accordingly, and it appeared from the proceedings that Strong's former master had already sold him to a new one, who produced the bill of sale and claimed the Negro as his property. As no charge of offense was made against Strong, and as the Lord Mayor was incompetent to deal with the legal question of Strong's liberty or otherwise, he discharged him, and the slave followed his benefactor out of court, no one daring to touch him. The man's owner immediately gave Sharp notice of an action to recover possession of his Negro slave, of whom he declared he had been robbed. About that time, 1767, the personal liberty of the Englishman, though cherished as a theory, was subject to grievous infringements, and was almost daily violated. The impressment of men for the sea service was constantly practiced, and, besides the press gangs, there were regular bands of kidnappers employed in London and all the large towns of the kingdom, to seize men for the East India Company's service. And when the men were not wanted for India, they were shipped off to the planters in the American colonies. Negro slaves were openly advertised for sale in the London and Liverpool newspapers. Rewards were offered for recovering and securing fugitive slaves, and conveying them down to certain specified ships in the river. The position of the reputed slave in England was undefined and doubtful. The judgments which had been given in the courts of law were fluctuating and various, resting on no settled principle. Although it was a popular belief that no slave could breathe in England, there were legal men of eminence who expressed a directly contrary opinion. The lawyers to whom Mr. Sharp resorted for advice, in defending himself in the action raised against him in the case of Jonathan Strong, generally concurred in this view, and he was further told by Jonathan Strong's owner, that the eminent Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, and all the leading counsel, were decidedly of opinion that the slave, by coming into England, did not become free, but might legally be compelled to return again to the plantations. Such information would have caused despair in a mind less courageous and earnest than that of Granville Sharp. But it only served to stimulate his resolution to fight the battle of the Negro's freedom, at least in England. Forsaken, he said, by my professional defenders, I was compelled, through the want of regular legal assistance, to make a helpless attempt at self-defense, though I was totally unacquainted either with the practice of the law or the foundations of it, having never opened a law book except the Bible in my life, until that time, when I most reluctantly undertook to search the indexes of a law library, which my bookseller had lately purchased. The whole of his time during the day was occupied with the business of the Ordnance Department, where he held the most laborious post in the office. He was therefore under the necessity of conducting his new studies late at night or early in the morning. He confessed that he was himself becoming a sort of slave. Writing to a clerical friend to excuse himself for delay in replying to a letter, he said, "I profess myself entirely incapable of holding a literary correspondence. What little time I have been able to save from sleep at night, and early in the morning, has been necessarily employed in the examination of some points of law, which admitted of no delay, and yet required the most diligent researches and examination in my study." Mr. Sharp gave up every leisure moment that he could command during the next 2 years, to the close study of the laws of England affecting personal liberty, wading through an immense mass of dry and repulsive literature, and making extracts of all the most important acts of Parliament, decisions of the courts, and opinions of eminent lawyers, as he went along. In this tedious and protracted inquiry he had no instructor, nor assistant, nor adviser. He could not find a single lawyer whose opinion was favorable to his undertaking. The results of his inquiries were, however, as gratifying to himself, as they were surprising to the gentlemen of the law. "God be thanked," he wrote, "there is nothing in any English law or statute, at least that I am able to find out, that can justify the enslaving of others." He had planted his foot firm, and now he doubted nothing. He drew up the result of his studies in a summary form. It was a plain, clear, and manly statement, entitled, "On the Injustice of Tolerating Slavery in England." And numerous copies, made by himself, were circulated by him amongst the most eminent lawyers of the time. Strong's owner, finding the sort of man he had to deal with, invented various pretexts for deferring the suit against Sharp, and at length offered a compromise, which was rejected. Granville went on circulating his manuscript tract among the lawyers, until at length those employed against Jonathan Strong were deterred from proceeding further, and the result was, that the plaintiff was compelled to pay treble costs for not bringing forward his action. The tract was then printed in 1769. In the meantime other cases occurred of the kidnapping of Negroes in London, and their shipment to the West Indies for sale. Wherever Sharp could lay hold of any such case, he at once took proceedings to rescue the Negro. Thus the wife of one Hylas, an African, was seized, and dispatched to Barbados. On which Sharp, in the name of Hylas, instituted legal proceedings against the aggressor, obtained a verdict with damages, and Hylas's wife was brought back to England free. Another forcible capture of a Negro, attended with great cruelty, having occurred in 1770, he immediately set himself on the track of the aggressors,